Well, after the last video that I did on the 1975 Buick Electra Park Avenue interior and how I thought it was one of the most over-the-top interiors ever put in a vehicle, got me thinking, what Ford would I select for such an honor? Certainly could think of a number of GM vehicles that had over-the-top interiors in the 70s, including the previously mentioned Park Avenue as well as the Fleetwood Talisman. Ford tended to have a bit more subdued interiors, particularly in that mid-70s era than GM. Got me thinking, what would I select as the most over-the-top Ford interior? Now, of course, there were various designer editions of the Mark V. There was also the Diamond Jubilee edition on Mark Vs and Thunderbirds that was pretty over-the-top. But I narrowed it down to really one vehicle that I think is the most over-the-top interior for Fords, and that is very specifically the 1971 four-door Thunderbird Brougham. This I find to be the most over-the-top interior that Ford ever did. Now, as many of you know, the Thunderbird started life in 1955 as a sports car, and really the story goes that Ford's division's general manager, Louis Crusoe, went to the Paris Auto Show with designer George Walker, and both were enamored with the Jaguar XK120, as well as Harley Earl's two-seat LeSabre convertible. And the Ford folks thought, well, why don't we have something like that? So they hurried this Thunderbird into production for 1955, and it was quite successful. Now, the Thunderbird story is one that's quite complicated. We won't get into that here. We're really going to focus on this 1971 Thunderbird interior. But the main thing to know is that from that original thought in 1955 to 1967, when a four-door Thunderbird was introduced, a lot changed, and the Thunderbird became more of a luxury car than a sports car. In that 1967 model year, as I mentioned, Ford offered a four-door sedan as well as hardtop coupes for the Thunderbird. And both were relatively good-selling models, priced in the high 4,000s, about $4,600 base price to $4,800 base price for the Landau four-door sedan. And combined across all models in 1967, Ford sold roughly 75,000 units. The four-door Thunderbird would last all the way until 1971, its final year, where it would sell just 6,550 units in that final model year. But I must say that the Thunderbird of this generation exited with quite the fanfare on the interior side. So there were three interiors offered in the 1971 Thunderbird. First, there was the standard interior. Then there was the Brougham interior, which I find to be the most opulent and over-the-top of any of the Ford interiors that I can think of. And then there was also the special Brougham interior, which had the hopsack cloth, which was nice, but I would say much more tasteful and even muted, if you will, in terms of overall design versus the Thunderbird Brougham interior. So why did I pick 1971 specifically? This Brougham interior and the special Brougham interior as well were offered in the 1970 model year. And why did I pick the four-door Thunderbird versus the two-door? Well, a couple reasons. First, to my mind, the four-door Thunderbird just takes what is already an over-the-top interior and makes it even more over-the-top. Something about the more airy cabin in the four-door combined with some extra interior space just takes this interior and all of its button tufting from the seats to the door panels and pleating, and I can't even describe, just take a look at the pictures, how over the top this interior is. The four-door being larger and having more interior room with which Ford could cover various surfaces with interior materials just puts it even more over the top. And I think the 1971 version is also more over the top than the 70 for a very simple reason, that when you ordered the Brougham interior in 1971, you got these high back kind of lounge seats, as opposed to 1970 where you had a lower style backrest with a headrest. And I think that the higher back seat, again, just puts this interior over the top and takes it to the next level. So it's pretty clear from the photos that this interior is pretty indescribably ridiculous. aside from just looking at it. Some people are going to say it looks like a New Orleans bordello, and I would have to agree with them. Even more so than the 69 Mark III interiors, which were 1 year only interior and also are quite over the top, but nothing compared to this. So I guess what are the overall thoughts on the Thunderbird itself, the 1971 Thunderbird? I guess the good part is if you really want one of these cars and you want one of the over-the-top interiors, they're actually extremely nice riding cars and driving cars as well. They are quite complicated, with many systems operating off a vacuum, including the door locks and the climate control. Thankfully, Ford didn't have hidden headlights anymore on the Thunderbirds in the 1970 and 71 model years, although the Mark III kept them. Other intricacies associated with this design and strange items include power windshield wipers that are operated not by electric motors, but operated off of the power steering pump under hood. However, in spite of the quirks, I must say, having owned Mark III, as well as having driven a number of these Thunderbirds, they drive supremely well. One of the best driving cars on the road ever, certainly of domestic vehicles. Yes, somebody's going to say the Citroen with the hydropneumatic suspension is nicer, and yes, those did have great rides, and that system was even employed in Bentleys in some cases. But the Citroen had an extremely buzzy, awful, tractor-like agricultural four-cylinder engine that kind of ruins the experience, at least for me. Whereas these Thunderbirds have a wonderfully silky smooth premium fuel 429 cubic inch V8 that produces plenty of horsepower as well as torque to move these vehicles around with relative speed and ease. It's definitely a vehicle that can keep up with modern traffic, cruising down the freeway at 80 plus miles an hour or around town, and can take off from a stoplight quite quickly as well. Aside from that, the quality on these vehicles is also really, really good, especially for the era of domestic cars. And the doors have wonderful closures. The overall body is put together very well with good fit and finish and high quality materials. Certainly higher quality than the next generation Thunderbird that came after it, introduced in 1972. The only downside to these vehicles, I would say, is that some are going to find the ride too mushy and nautical, and that is just how Fords of this era rode, particularly the Ford luxury cars. And the steering ratio is very, very slow, no feedback transmitted through the wheel at all. It's true the GM and Chryslers of the era didn't have much feedback either, but the ratios and the overall steering gears were much more pleasant, particularly in the GMs, than on these Fords. Aside from that, however, I will say that if you locate one, it's going to be an overall comfortable cruiser, something that's great to put the family in. You really won't regret it, so long as you can find a mechanic who's willing to work on the sometimes complicated systems. Oh, and don't forget about the wonderful Autolite 4300 four-barrel carburetor underhood, another thing that will be sure to give you some trouble. Throw an Edelbrock or Holly on and you'll be just fine. In any case, hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you agree that this is the most over-the-top Ford interior of all time. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.